Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another vlog. This one is related to a book that I just finished reading for the third time, I don't remember which. I know at least I've read it once before, that was 10 years ago. So, all I can say with this is that a lot changes in your perspective on a book in 10 years. And I can honestly say I noticed some nuances with the book I didn't notice the first time. Maybe it's my maturity in those 10 years. Maybe it's noticing things I just didn't notice before with the wording. Maybe it's actually reading some stories from the guy who inspired the author's work, especially bits and pieces of this work. And of course, the novel I am talking about is Stephen King's It, a novel that he worked on from 81 to 85. So it took him that long to write. And given the length and probably like a couple drafts he had to go through, it's not surprising. The length of this, a work of this length is bound to have at least a couple inconsistencies, especially with how the book is formatted. And I can honestly say I still enjoy it. The twist near the end, I understand a lot more now, having read some of the Inspirations work, which in case you guys don't know, that would be Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Mr. H.P. Lovecraft of Cthulhu Mythos fame, which I will talk about how that inspired this when I get to some of the aspects of the Macroverse. Other than just giving a brief overview right now, say the book is good. If you haven't read it, but you have seen the movie, definitely comes with my recommendation. It's a long book in the tooth, but it does come with my recommendation. And if you enjoy the movie, there's one reason I would say to read the book, and that is that some aspects of the movie, I'm talking about the miniseries of this right now, will make a lot more sense when you read the book. And that's because, mainly with how they had to abridge the movie. And I'd still say they did a good job of abridging it. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but I remember enough to say, yeah, they did a good job abridging it. Of course, they cut out a lot of stuff, but hey, a two-parter, they have to. But with what little they kept in, and with some of the original scenes they put in to, allow for standards and practices in the abridgments, I think they did a good job capturing the spirit of the book, at least, especially the whole childhood innocence aspect, faith, the nature of it. Especially that part, because you can't really show a lot of mutilations in a made-for-TV movie. You can imply and show, like, aftermath things without showing bodies, but you can get away with enough to give off the whole less is more aspect, which is one of the reasons it works, especially with Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise the Dancing Clown. Now, with the book, it does have a lot of prose shifts. I mean, there are parts where the characters are musing on the situation they're in. Usually this is in a situation before it does a flashback, like the beginning of chapters in the June, July sections when it's talking about 58. Like the character that's usually the lead throughout that chapter, perspective-wise, their adult form is like musing, like they're getting on a plane or something to go back to Derry, then it shifts back to the memory to talk about the specific event, and it's all from their point of view. There's a couple little interludes that are diary entries written by Mike, which are very interesting because it gives a little overview into the events that have happened in Derry, specifically past events connected to its opening and closing, and also a little insight into why it took them so long to call the others. The opening chapters, though, are more like traditional chapters. They still have that little shift thing, but they're more the opening parts, like the whole thing with Georgie's death and then the death that opens the new set of murders. And of course, there's inner monologue stuff like any novel's going to have, which that's one main advantage that the book has with regards to revealing Pennywise's true nature, which I'll get to later, but that's about it to say with the prose. I mean, it shifts, but a novel this long, it's bound to. There's one thing in one chapter that is unique to that chapter, as far as I can remember, and that is a newspaper entry, but it complements the following stuff. But when you're reading it, it's like, did this really need to be in here? But then when you read the following stuff, you're like, okay, that makes sense. And it makes sense to have that chapter in there. It feels a little bit like a filler chapter, at least that aspect of it, but it works because it shows a little bit of Pennywise's nature when it comes to how he messes with kids other than the losers. It's a nice little inclusion. One thing I'd like to mention is that Pennywise does not let any of the stories that happen in Derry go out further than the surrounding area. Like all the child murderers, the characters mention this several times. This would be big news, and Bev even brings up what happened in Castle Rock during the events of the Dead Zone with that killer. That made national news and all that, but then there's like, well, Pennywise doesn't let it. and the people don't question it. It's one of those things that no matter how many people die, it's not going to be big news if it happens in a small town. And compared to Castle Rock, Derry is a small town. It's just small town business. Not to say Castle Rock is big, but it's still a small town. And also, I think something like that would probably get more national attention. I think mainly that was because it was a cop and there was no supernatural thing, whereas with Derry, Pennywise is manipulating it, and it's one of the things people don't question since it's a small town. And the funny thing is that unlike the movie where we don't get the indication anyone other than the losers notice anything is amiss, in the book you do get an indication that there is some things amiss. Like at one point at the beginning when it's the murder of the gay guy, his boyfriend is mentioning that when he saw Pennywise, he understood now what Pennywise was. The cops obviously don't believe him. They think he's just hysterical, but he's like, I understood what he is. What is he? He is Derry. He is this town, that guy. And even later, when Mike is interviewing some people about the past instances in Derry, a couple of them, mainly, for instance, the drugstore owner, mentioned that they saw the clown. He's like, you know about the clown and all that? And it's thought that there might be something off about him, but they never question it. And even they seem to notice stuff about the cycles and how things just seem to happen in Derry. And, they just let it happen and they deal with it afterwards. Like, I didn't make a note of this one, but it's in the last interlude where Mike mentioned something that happened in the past. It was an instance when these lumber workers were talking about unionizing and 3 of the ringleaders were killed and the 4th escaped. He came into a bar one evening near the end of the year and massacred a bunch of people with his axe. The only people that did anything were the people he was trying to kill. The rest of them just sat at the bar like, what's going on? And he mentions that even one nonchalantly kicked a head that came rolling back over there like it was nothing, no reaction. And when the guy was done and he came out of the John, he's like, close that thing, it stinks in there. It isn't until after he's arrested and taken to the police station and the people have had a couple hours to sit and drink more that they decide to do something, and they go break in and lynch the guy. It's like they take care of town business. They let the guy do his business and they go out and do theirs. Pennywise does not let any of them tell anyone else other than people in the town. Only they seem to notice. And it's because it's a subtle mind control that he's doing. The people don't even realize they're being controlled. That's the interesting thing about it. Another example of one who's being controlled is the chief of police during the main event of the novel, where Mike mentions conversations he has with him, and the guy's basically just doing all he can to either avoid Mike or not answer his questions directly. Tells him he needs to see a head doctor or something. Also try to cover up some instances to say it's not related to any murders, like one child that disappears, which the book never gives a clear indication whether she was actually taken by Pennywise or that the cop theory was correct. But I lean more towards the Pennywise theory based on Mike's musings. That is, they say, the father kidnapped her, even though there's only one set of prints leading away. That is the main reason, because if Pennywise doesn't cast a shadow, then he probably won't leave footprints. While I'm on the subject of town business, before I get too far away from that, a couple other instances that Mike mentions in these interludes about stuff that happened in the past was the fire at the Black Spot, which is when members of the Maine Legion of White Decency, which was the Northerners' version of the KKK, burnt down a place called the Black Spot, which was a club that the black enlisted men at the Derry base made. And over time, people from town started to go in there and party, and they didn't like that. It's basically just, ignorant older white people and also some of their younger descendants thinking, yeah, we don't like them uppity so-and-sos up in there going above their station, hanging out with these good old white folks, mainly like younger white people that they're upset with. And they get so uppity that they think it's their job to go do something, and they go and burn it down, and they kill a couple people. This is actually where we get the Dick Halloran cameo, which it's nice to see Dick Halloran in a cameo here, even if it's not under the best of circumstances. And this was the thing that closed that one. It was opened by the murder of the Bradley gang, which was basically, it's basically like a Bonnie and Clyde stand-in with some more people. They're killed in town similarly to how Bonnie and Clyde were, an ambush, where they basically like hands up and then they start the shooting. And the thing with that is that that's the story that Mike gets out of the drugstore owner. And as the guy tells Mike that, or when there's like a good basketball game or baseball game that becomes legendary, people will lie and say whether they were there, and you can kind of tell, but you don't want to interrupt it. Whereas with this, people know that other people from town were there, and they remember who they saw there, but nobody will openly admit that they were there. I mean, one of the people that is flat out denied to have been there was the chief of police, yet the drugstore owner says he saw him there, and you can even tell from a picture Mike mentions that the guy was there. He wasn't off quail hunting that day. He's just being a liar. In both instances, you can see someone dressed like a clown. It's not exactly in a clown outfit, but enough to where Pennywise can blend in while he's out and about. And of course, this in a scene that happens later where the losers are doing this little smoke circle thing in their clubhouse, and Rich and Mike see its arrival. That's when they realize that it has always been there, and it basically is Derry because everything that has gone all around it comes from it. As I briefly mentioned, there are opening and closing things to each cycle, which the movie does not mention, which I can understand why, but it's an interesting little thing, and that is that there has to be an opening act of violence to start the major part of Pennywise's cycle, and then a closing one. As if, okay, I'm full, I'm going to bed. And it's how you can track the pattern to see if it actually came with the 27 years or if it was a little later, a little early, but it always comes. And it's almost like Pennywise manipulates it. He's like sensing the climate, like, okay, this is going to be the opener. It's about that time. And it just goes from there. Now, another thing that the movie cuts out, but which I think is very interesting and ties in both to the whole Cthulhu inspiration that this novel has, and more into King's grand mythos, and that is two other characters, one who is seen and one who is only mentioned briefly, but you get the indication he's there. There is the turtle, which is another cosmological being like it, and then we have the other, which is a being that's not seen but is kind of hinted at to be the god of this universe. So if you tie it in with the Dark Tower, you could think it's Gan. And with how he speaks to the children, briefly, gives them their power and all that, you can tell that that's probably who it is. In the turtle, it doesn't give a clear indication, but it could be Martin or Marin, or however, I forget. I think it's Martin. I think it's Martin. I'm just going to call him the turtle because I forget how to pronounce it, if that's the correct pronunciation. I know the bear is Shardak. It's one of the beam guardians from the Dark Tower series. There's a connection between them, see the turtle of enormous girth, on his back he holds the earth. But of course this book makes it seem like the turtle has died later on, but it could just be some of its tricks, but doubtful with how Bill reacts. But you never know, the spider might be bad enough to try something like that, and there's also the whole thing that maybe the turtle being physically dead, but not his power, is connected to the whole thing about the beam guardians getting sick. But then that'd be the question of, how is he a cosmological being and then also a beam guardian? It's maybe one of those things that, like, maybe his beam guardian ship body died, so he's only exists as energy now. Like he tells Bill, everything is energy. And this, of course, ties into its true form, which is a spider. And it's not really its true form, it's just the closest that humans can get to approximating its true form in a physical form. Which, that's what Bill muses when they first see him as kids. But even so, it being a spider is not really bad. I mean, in the movie, it kind of comes off as a little weird. Like, you're watching and you're like, that's it? A spider after everything else scary? Its true form is a spider? It can be a little weird, but it's another one of the tie-ins to the Cthulhu mythos. In the Cthulhu mythos, all the gods and weird creatures are things you probably wouldn't expect. They're like weird, misshapen things. I mean, just look at Cthulhu. He's a dragon giant with basically octopus feelers as part of his face, and that's one of the gods. And there are other weird described ones, like Yog-Sothoth is basically just a big gelatinous mass of flesh with like tentacles and other weird things coming off him, and yet he's supposed to be the supreme being. The only one that really is normal looking is Nyarlathotep. So him being a spider makes sense from that angle, especially since he's kind of an amalgamation spider. And think about it, if Shelob can be scary, and her ancestor Ungoliath can be scary, what's wrong with it being it? It is probably closer to Ungoliath than Shelob anyway. And they even mention it does have a stinger like Shelob, so there's that going for it. But the whole spider thing kind of connects to the whole turtle thing, like it's supposed to be consumption with the spider versus wisdom, I think it would be, or some other, I can't think off the top of my head what would be the more apt comparison with that. Moderation or something along that level, but there's that little dichotomy there that they hate each other, like, but the spider doesn't say anything while the turtle's around until they're far away from it. It's like, oh, I see you met my friend the spider. I thought he had died years ago. And he might as well have for all the good he's going to do you. That's just a paraphrase of a conversation he has with Bill after they meet the turtle. The turtle actually has a pretty weird line. Like, he's like, when you get involved with cosmological shit like this, you just got to throw away the instruction manual. I just love that dialogue. But anyway, another reason a spider makes sense is, from what I hear, that's one of King's fears is spiders, which with that angle, it's like, okay, it's his personal fear. He's throwing it in there as his personal fear. And if you know about the whole thing with how the Dark Tower series ends, it makes sense that its true form would be one of King's personal fears. And that also ties into the whole thing about the Crimson King having a spider form, which, ever since I've read the Dark Tower series the first time, I've always wondered, is there supposed to be some weird connection to it in the Crimson King? Like, I know the Crimson King is the son of Arthur Eld and a tryst he had with the Crimson Queen, so could it be that the Crimson Queen is it? Or, like how we see that, that's another thing the movie cuts out, that it is female and pregnant, and that's one of the things that Stan remembers when he remembers everything, that in his own personality, you know, like I say, he'd rather die clean than get dirty. It makes me wonder what that is. Like, if Pennywise is not the Crimson Queen, is he descended from the Crimson Queen naturally instead of having a tryst with a powerful human to create a hybrid offspring that would have a great power in itself? One of those questions, if I ever got a chance to meet King, I'd ask him if he'd ever thought about that, because it's an interesting little concept there, the whole spider connection. And if there is a connection like that, it's like, what is it exactly? And then, of course, another Cthulhu connection is the Deadlights, its true form and where it lives, basically drives you insane when you see it. Either that or you die, because Bev's husband dies when he makes more from the spider before he even has a chance to see the Deadlights. Whereas Audra, just like in the movie, goes insane after seeing it, which is a very Lovecraftian device. Because usually knowledge in Lovecraft works comes with the cost of driving you insane. Like, when humans in Lovecraft's works find out more about the truth behind everything that we in his universe know, like for existence, the existence of Cthulhu, if outside of the cults, it starts to drive you insane. Like, people who have seen Cthulhu usually are driven insane or die. So, something like that. The narrator of the Call of Cthulhu, as he's reading more about it, he finds out that the person whose diary he's reading has actually seen Cthulhu, and while he didn't die right away, it eventually is what led to his death. And this guy fears, I'm going to probably die next. So it's to tie in with all that. And that's just one example in Lovecraft's works. There's probably others, but it's one of those things that knowledge has a price, and some things men should not meddle in. It's a kind of a love reference to that, but since the story goes off on its own way, it doesn't fully follow that Lovecraftian trope, but there's enough of an influence there to where you can see where it comes from. Another thing that the book touches on is childhood faith. And this comes in two major forms. One is how they constantly will back each other up, and this goes with the whole fact that there are 7 of them being a mystical number, and this is how they combat it with their faith. And this is also why silver is a weakness to it, because that's one of the minor things in the movie that I never really understood until I read the book. It's like, okay, silver is a weakness to it. How are they coming up with this comparison? You can make the argument that maybe, without talking to one another, they figured, if this thing can take on the forms of other things, maybe it's weak against silver, because one of its forms it took is a werewolf. It's similar logic in the book to how they come up with that. It's like, well, if it takes the form of a werewolf, maybe we can use silver to kill it. And it hurts it, and they almost kill it, but it doesn't quite kill it. But it is that faith, and also the fact that Pennywise has to abide by the rules and laws of whatever form he's in. Ergo, he's a werewolf, so he has the strengths and the weaknesses. but it's also their faith that they use as a weapon. And that's actually what Pennywise feeds off of, faith. As you see, he bites the children, some of the ones he kills, but he doesn't, like, gnaw on them. Like, some of them, they might have, like, some bite marks, but it's not like something's obviously been feeding on them. It looks more like something just mutilated them. Whereas it's their fear that he feeds off of, and he likes childhood fears a lot better because they're easier, simpler, whereas adults, we have more complex fears, like... And Everybody Loves Raymond joke sums it up. When was the last time you could think about cavity... When was the last time you could think about... When was the last time you could think about candy and it'd be alright? Candy, cavities, dental work, drilling, it's stuff like that. That, as adults, you still have fears, but they're more complex. Now, there might be an exception, like Kuntz, the guard where Henry Bowers is. He is afraid of Doberman, so it's an easy thing, take the form of a Doberman and then kill his ass. Whereas most humans, it's going to be more complex fears. Except for the losers, he could kind of use their past experiences, fear there, but that's a unique situation. And the whole childhood faith actually ties in with how they ended up defeating him, which is something called the Ritual of Chud. I am not 100% sure on that pronunciation, but that's what the word looks like. C-H-U-D, Chud. Where it's basically a thing they learned about in one book where it's you find a demon or a vampire or something, and you're both supposed to bite each other's tongues, and you tell jokes until one breaks, and let's say the creature beats you, it kills you. So they do something similar to that, but it's a more mental thing. It's a mental battle, but faith is connected, and that's how they end up hurting it. And then, of course, in the end, they actually physically kill it because it's weak enough to where they can reach in and get its heart like they do in the movie. But it's more a battle of faith and friendship and all that. And they stand together as a unit, and they end up defeating it. Of course, there's great cost involved, which I'm not going to spoil here, but it just goes there. It's faith and friendship. That's... If you're going to boil down this book to 2 words, it'd be that. Or if you want to do one, it'd probably be... And like I said, the book's a little long in the tooth, but it's a good read. And how it shifts back and forth could be a bit confusing at points, but I think it works. It's definitely one of my favorite King books. I put it in my top 10. It's one that I don't see myself rereading too often, mainly because of the length, because it is a chore to read through because of its length. But it's one I could see myself, if I want to, rereading yearly. But I don't know if I will next year or not, but because there's a lot of other books I need to get through first. But definitely a fun book to reread. If I had to give it a rating, probably 4 out of 5. If you're a fan of King's movies or his other works and you haven't read it, you definitely should read it.